Chairman, Excellencies, Ministers, fellow aldermen and masters, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much, Chris, for the initiative and for inviting Claire and me here this evening. The title of this reflection is Whiskey Galore at the Mansion House. One of you asked me earlier, what does galore mean? It just means lots, plenty of whiskey at the Mansion House. And those of you familiar with the book and the subsequent Ealing comedy by Compton Mackenzie called Whiskey Galore, you may be expecting a rollicking tale of whiskey-fueled intrigue around the corridors of the Mansion House. Well, there are some good whiskey-related stories to tell, but it would be indiscreet to reveal too many of the house's secrets. And Chris assured me that this was a serious audience. But as Scotsman I was born, and only the 8th Scottish Lord Mayor on record. Dame Fiona Woolf then became the 9th in late 2013. And one of the several themes of the year was certainly Scotland. Not only whiskey and tablet served at every meal, but also championing the strong relationship between London and Scotland in financial and business services. And how had I ended up in London? I had come down south full after schooling, full of the confidence you might expect in an inexperienced young Scot in London. I set out to become the greatest banker, the greatest musician, and the greatest romantic that London had ever seen. The illusions of youth, I was only an average piano player. Talking of pianos, it is thanks to an ancestor, Gifford, that we had one at home in St Andrews. Paul Gifford left Scotland in the 1850s to work on the railways in Peru and Argentina, where my father was born. The Gifford family of 19th century Dumfriesshire were farm workers, and it is said that Paul Gifford left the country in a hurry. He may have become on the bad side of the international cross-border cattle trade, which is understood finally caught up with him. Anyway, the Gifford family prospered in Argentina until the family dispersed in the 1930s and they invested their wealth in Argentinian government bonds. Rampant inflation took away almost the whole value. Riches gained and riches lost, a story of life. My father landed up as a lecturer at St Andrews University after the Spanish Civil War and Oxford in the late 1940s, thereby bringing that branch of the Giffords back to Scotland after a 100-year interval, with just about enough cash to buy a good piano. I have it still. Ladies and gentlemen, to put these reflections into context, we must first cast our minds back to 2013, already 4 years ago. And I would like to test your memories if I can. Can anyone remind me quickly who won the Premier Football League in 2013? Correct, Manchester United. Thank you to the Cordwainers. Now, who won the Eurovision Song Contest that year? It was Denmark, with Only Teardrops by Emily de Forest. Who won the 2013 Open Golf Championship? Nope. Phil Mickelson. And who won the Cardiff Singer of the Year? The young American soprano Jamie Barton. And finally, which whiskey won the best overall malt whiskey at the International Whiskey Awards 2013? It was Ardbeg, a distillery on the Isle of Islay. And in an irony possible only in an international global world, who owns this greatest of Scottish produce, this crowning glory, this gem of whiskey distilleries? Louis Vuitton, a French fashion house. Can you believe it? 2013 has been described by some as a year of tragedy, transition, and triumph. We had the Boston Marathon attack and the Kenya shopping mall bomb, which added to a sense of vulnerability everywhere, and some of the most devastating typhoons of recent times occurred around the world, in the US and in Asia, in the Philippines. Of course, both unnatural terrorist bombs and natural typhoons have happened for a long time, but there's been a distinct surge in concern in immigrant-associated terrorism and climate change in the last 4-5 years. Economically, 2013 as a year progressed rather well, and for many, the recovery post the 2008 crash took hold, and real green shoots were seen, especially in Europe and America. Bankers were still unpopular, but at least they started making amends by putting their balance sheets out to work again, and the stock markets reached new heights of optimism. So everyone felt better, not least the coalition government of the day. And finally, the World Trade Organization brought into effect the Bali Package, aimed at loosening global trade barriers. Not exciting, perhaps, but important then, and now of increased relevance to post-Brexit Britain. And by the way, Prince George of Cambridge was born. It was in this context that putting a banker into Mansion House might have been seen as a risky proposition, were it not for the fact that the Scandinavian banks, and I still work for a Swedish bank, had not been caught out by the financial crash, nor had they been tainted by scandal, having learnt some hard lessons in the 1990s. I was delighted not to have been working for an American bank, I can tell you. And one of my main reflections on this time is that the City of London learnt a lot from the crash. The city corporation, that is, that runs the square mile, the marketplace, as opposed to businesses at large. I believe that many of the actions that were taken then and the policies of the city now, that it now undertakes, they reflect a sense of realism, of humility, which came with post-crash criticism. The focus on giving and philanthropy, for instance, was renewed, as it was on ethics and good practice, on looking after our neighbourhood London boroughs, and talking up the good work of the livery companies. Indeed, one of my other prominent themes of 2013 was the city in society, chosen to promote the city's role in creating jobs and paying taxes and being philanthropic. And the city corporation also started putting more emphasis on promotional initiatives, which have proved remarkably successful. The campaign to promote Islamic banking, for instance, brought a new and positive perspective to Middle East relations, and quite a bit of business, as well as attention. And the drive in legal services in the areas of arbitration and dispute resolution, brilliantly championed by Sir David Wootton in 2012, has resulted in scores, hundreds even, of new law firms setting up in London. No one really knows what they do, but we are delighted they are here. During 2013, the drive to bring offshore renminbi trading to London grew steadily, and in 2015, London became effectively the main trading hub for renminbi outside China and Hong Kong. And recently, the city has launched a green finance initiative to bring focus to the power of finance to support projects reducing carbon usage. I'm delighted to be chairing that initiative. And I believe the increased impetus for these efforts stemmed from a realization that, in business as in relationships, as my Finnish friends say, you have to be humble enough. And I also believe that attitude will keep us in better stead through the upcoming Brexit discussions about where Europe will conduct some of its international financial services business. A sense of humility will keep our negotiators flexible, I hope, and open to sense. I also reflect that 2013 showed the extraordinary resilience of the city. That was the year that the stock markets really consolidated their gains. The FTSE was at a seasonal low of 5,600 in November 2012 and just under 6,700 in November 2013. It's, of course, just coincidence that these are roughly the dates of the Lord Mayor's show in each year. And whilst the UK banks continued to flounder amidst LIBOR and PPI scandals in 2013, the major foreign banks in London rebounded with vigour and with balance sheets ready to lend. In other words, the marketplace was filling up again, even if the new stallholders were not British. Newcomers were also strong buyers of property, accelerating a trend started decades ago by Gulf investors. The city has always been international. It has become significantly more so in the last 5 years. So 2013 was truly a year of transition, of the recovery of confidence in the city, preparing the way for the boom times which followed, and of its further internationalization. In my own year, as in every year, of course, there were too many memorable moments to reflect on, more than a few, like the Lady Thatcher's funeral, greeting, escorting, and leading Her Majesty down the length of St. Paul's Cathedral in full ermine gown and train. That was me, that is, not her. By the way, have you ever tried walking backwards with a train? I bet Sir David has, and it's not easy. One camera, positioned at a sideways angle, gave the impression that the mourning sword I was carrying, in its sheath, came dangerously close to Her Majesty as I raised it. That got 62,000 YouTube hits. Fame at last. It was just a few days earlier that I had had the occasion to give a long service award in full mayoral kit and chain to a janitor, an old-age pensioner in Portsoken Ward, who was moved to speechless tears at the enormity of it all. In the first few days, I would occasionally rail against the dressing up and the seemingly needless ceremony until my valet, Colin, said, "Sir, it's been like this for 800 years. Perhaps we should just get on with it." And moments like the Pensioners' Long Service Award proved the value of that. As a reflection about both these contrasting occasions reinforced throughout the year, I would say it's not about the person, it's about the office. The office of Lord Mayor, which will continue much longer than the memory of any individual incumbent. You will also know that by far the largest part of the job is representing and speaking up for British financial services, travelling abroad, visiting 32 countries in over 100 days of travel, as I did, plus 5 financial centres in Scotland. You may not have known there were 5 financial centres in Scotland, and it didn't count as a foreign country then. State visits by the President of Korea, now deposed, and the Emir of Kuwait, who survives. Choose your politics carefully. The interdependency that I mentioned earlier between Scotland and London in financial services cannot be overstated. The lowlands of Scotland, from Dundee and Perth via Edinburgh to Livingston and Glasgow, sees a plethora, a multitude of branches of foreign and UK banks and companies who service and work closely with their head offices and their counterparts down south. JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, State Street, Citi are all there, wondering a little, no doubt, what the future holds. My own bank, SEB, owns a specialist asset management service company itself in Edinburgh. Morgan Stanley has found the service in Scotland so good that they have designated Glasgow a global competence centre, and they have 1,300 people there, their 5th largest site worldwide. Independence? I wonder how much sense that makes. Overseas, I was constantly struck by the high regard in which the UK is held, the admiration for the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law, almost always accompanied by the comment that UK companies didn't seem to bother with coming to see them enough. They often didn't seem to want to compete. I felt this reflected a certain arrogance in the approach of some major companies, outside, I should say, oil and gas and financial services. We rather expect people to come to us rather than go and see them. In a post-Brexit context, that is not an acceptable attitude. As an amusing aside, I remember well one trip to what we called Burma, but which the new government there wanted to call Myanmar. And the dilemma was, how was I to refer to where I was? What would the speeches specify? How would we upset neither British nor Burmese sensitivities? The Foreign Office came up with a perfect solution, and I spent 3 whole days referring to your beautiful country. Whilst there, we took one flight up country on a plane with only 6 seats, so small there were no room for stewards or stewardesses. As we headed for the runway, the pilot announced in perfect English that the drink service would happen on takeoff. On ascent, he said, "A crate will slide down the aisle, just take what you want." And on descent, please put your empties back again in the crate as it slides back. I was especially pleased to be able to spend almost a week in Japan, where I had lived in the 90s, consolidating the city's relationship with this important and often under-recognised stakeholder in the City of London. I have twice hosted Mr. Abe here in recent years, the first in 2013 for his major overseas policy speech after becoming Prime Minister. A privilege. And of course, China has risen in prominence dramatically over the last 15 years. It emerged in 2013 as an international borrower with a surge in bank debt, more recently seen in the green bond sector here in London. But perhaps the principal duty of the year, as I'm sure you've heard before, is to live and live well in a Grade 1 listed Georgian palace, working in harmony with its staff while you are there. It is your house for the year, and you sign for the silver as you take office. The full secretariat comes complete with programme managers, sword bearer, city marshal, cooks and waiters, a driver, valet, even someone to lay out your underclothes in the morning. Naturally, an experience like that can change your life, your expectations. When we got back home, Claire found it quite a challenge to fill all these roles, but she's managing fine, I'm happy to say. I was also very lucky with my sheriffs that year, Geoffrey Evans and Nigel Pullman, who were exemplary in their commitment and support. Indeed, they laughed at every joke, including those they had heard many times before, and seemed to mean it too. They and the Mansion House staff were simply a joy to work with. And Chairman, if I'm permitted to give you just a few other memorable moments, they include occasions like my 18-year-old son Hector coming in rather late one evening at the back lodge and setting off every alarm in the Mansion House by going to bed by a very circuitous route. We were not popular. Or Claire's 17-year-old Freddie enjoying port with my chaplain George Bush in the long parlour one evening way after bedtime. Naturally, on discovery, we remonstrated with George at such an unclerical scene. George exploded with indignation and told us it was Freddie who had insisted he stay up with him. Or walking round all the city's 55 churches on a single Sunday with sheriffs, crowning Claire's own campaign to shine a light on the work of the city churches. And in the House, the near-naked statue of Sardanapalus stands right outside the Lord Mayor's office, a virile model for the young men of the mayoral team to follow. Sardanapalus was a profligate, a degenerate carouser who said that the only real purpose of life was pleasure. I wondered why he was so prominently positioned right there. Was this a hint, I thought? And the first City Beer Fest, my own love of beer celebrated, and now an annual event in Guildhall Yard, last year attracting over 4,000 people, coming up soon on the 6th of July. Be there. Or a Highland Ball named the Reel of the 51st, held on the Lady Mayoress's 51st birthday, with Egyptian Hall swathed in tartan. And of course, the organ commissioned by the city for the 60th anniversary of the Queen's coronation, now resident in the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, and which spent the best part of the year in the Egyptian Hall, much used and much loved. And that brings us to music. And Carmine, thank you so much for your playing earlier. Beautiful. Thank you very much indeed. Should we give him another round of applause, please? Yes. Music and the arts and the city's contribution to them was another major theme of 2013. Indeed, it was the year that we all rediscovered the notion of soft power. There was even a House of Lords inquiry set up that year, which I gave evidence to. A thriving art scene was again understood to be a key part of what makes London an attractive place to live. And I might reflect here that this emphasis too was born out of the financial crash of 2008, as the city looked for supporting factors for London to be an attractive proposition to investors and prospectors. This will be needed as well, as much as ever in a post-Brexit world. And the principal beneficiary of the 2013 appeal, as you can read about, was the City Music Foundation. This foundation aims to turn talent into success. CMF auditions annually and takes the very best classical and jazz musicians and ensembles. 100 have applied this year for less than 10 places, and gives them in-work education in everything from legal contracts and accounts management to presentation skills. It helps them with a career-launching video or like a project like a CD or a video, and it arranges performances for them. So many brilliant gold medal-winning young musicians have faltered when it comes to the business end of being a professional musician. CMF solves that. It has already found a unique role in the music industry with an innovative career development program and has proved this many times over in its short 4-year life. I recommend it to you and invite you all to become members of the Founders Circle or to become sponsors of artists or events. And when you next review your own charitable commitments, substantial as I'm sure they are in this audience, please keep CMF in mind. Details of CMF, its artists, the Founders Circle, and the forthcoming Beer Fest will be given to you when you leave. You can't escape. And to mention just one of the other causes the appeal supported, we had the joy of purchasing and foresting a plot of land adjacent to Epping Forest, the first addition to the forest in the 125 years since the Epping Forest Act of 1878. Claire had grown up close by, and she threw herself into this project with gusto. She also produced 4 new books during the year, 2 as new productions of the children's story of Dick Whittington, and 2 on the Mansion House paintings and statues, recently complemented by a 3rd on the gold and silver plate collection. Indeed, Claire could give quite a reflection of the year from her own perspective, but you have to ask her about that yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm drawing to a close. Reflecting finally on 2013, on a wonderfully interesting and invigorating year as chief salesman for British Financial Services, I can only, in all humility, say it was an honour and a privilege to serve. And Claire joins me in that sentiment. And as I've also said before, I'm an optimist who believes not only that my whiskey glass is half full, but there's normally another bottle in a cupboard as well. So to finish, may I return to Scotland with the following final reflection, which is entirely true, unlike some of the others. No, this is entirely true. Because even if the world has many problems, it's what happens closest to home that affects us most, and where we find some of the answers to the great questions, the great riddles of life. We were in Glasgow in February 2013, in bonny Glasgow, and the deacon convener of the Trades Houses of Glasgow, Colonel John Kelly of the Black Watch, gave us a very good lunch with plenty of whiskey and lots of good stories. And at the end he slapped his sides and said, where in the world would mankind be without a sense of humour? There was a silence, and someone said, probably Edinburgh. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure.